Boston, 1871. The year progress was supposed to conquer superstition. Rail lines stretched like veins through the city, industry pulsed with iron lungs, and Harvard's medical school preached that every secret of the body would soon be catalogued, named, mastered. But beneath that polished promise was a silence science itself refused to put into ink. Because in the alleys just beyond Beacon Hill, in a crumbling residence that no census dared to finalize, there lived a family who did not fit the category of human the institutions wanted the public to see. When inspectors came, they left their reports unfinished. Physicians who entered did not speak again of what they found. And when Harvard's own anatomical society whispered of an inbred line that had carried itself unbroken for generations within the city limits, the order came down. Deny it, erase it, pretend it never existed. But fragments remain. A torn ledger here, a physician's confession letter there, witnesses too shaken to write in their own names. They all point to the same hidden fact. There was a household where children were born not of marriage but of repetition, siblings marrying siblings, mothers birthing sons who would become their own husbands, fathers who were also grandfathers, and infants who carried faces already seen before. And yet, the horror was not simply deformity of the body. The real terror, the one that made science itself recoil, was that these children did not seem to die. They did not vanish with disease the way others in the slums did. Decade after decade, the same names appear in Boston's burial ledgers, but never attached to corpses. The same 5 names, resurfacing across 60 years, always young, always unchanging. That is why the institutions buried the story, not because of shame, but because it broke the narrative that science had the final word, that the flesh was finite, that death was inevitable. In 1871, Boston hid something so obscene, so blasphemous to reason, that it risked unraveling the authority of knowledge itself. And now, you've stumbled into it. You've found what was meant to stay hidden in dust and silence. The question is not whether you believe it. The question is whether you can handle the descent into what Boston erased. Because once you hear it, you will never be the same. The first trace does not come from a newspaper, nor from Harvard's records, nor even from the city itself. It comes from a letter dated March 9, 1871, written by a physician named Dr. Jonathan Hale, never published, never submitted, found only in the private drawers of his widow half a century later. The ink trembles in places, as though the man's hand could not decide between confession and restraint. He begins plainly. I was summoned to a dwelling on Endicott Street near the Old North Square. The request bore no signature. The coin left in my pocket was too much for the service asked. I fear I have trespassed upon something not meant to be witnessed. Inside that narrow home, he describes rooms without mirrors, windows boarded from the inside, curtains nailed into the plaster. The air was thick, humid, though no fire burned. He was led, not by a man or a woman, but by a boy, no older than 14. Yet his speech was precise, unhesitating, as though he had rehearsed the same script for years. The doctor asked his name. The boy replied, I am Nathaniel, and I am Thomas. I am also my mother's brother. At first Hale dismissed this as confusion or madness, but when the boy brought him to the sick bed upstairs, the illusion of reason fractured. Upon that bed lay a girl, no more than 12 by appearance, pale and motionless. Yet her chest did not rise. Her skin was warm, and when Hale reached for her wrist to feel the pulse, her hand gripped his with a strength that no dying child should have possessed. Her eyes opened, not startled but calm, and she spoke in a voice almost identical to the boy's. We do not need another name. We have kept it pure. Hale ends the letter with only 3 sentences. They are not breeding, they are repeating, I cannot return. The rest of the page is blackened with ink, as though erased by fire. This was not the last time such a letter surfaced, nor the last time the names repeated. And if you think this was an isolated madness, an alley tragedy swept into the gutter, understand this. Boston's own parish ledgers carried the same 5 names across 6 decades, birth after birth, marriage after marriage. No deaths recorded. The city grew, the factories thundered, but in one forgotten house, time was not obeyed. It begins in the parish books. not the ones proudly displayed in Boston's archives today, but the ones tucked inside cabinets, bound in cracked leather, where ink has bled into the fibers like veins. These ledgers were not meant to be questioned. They were supposed to be routine: marriages, baptisms, burials, the cycle of ordinary life. But from 1810 until 1871, one pattern pulses like a black vein through those pages. 5 names, always the same, written in the same hand for decades, as though the priest were transcribing the same service again and again. The surnames shift slightly, Reeve, Rhea, but the first names repeat without deviation: Nathaniel, Thomas, Eliza, Ruth, Mary, over and over. What should follow each marriage is the natural record: baptisms of children, the next generation marked in neat ink. But instead, there is nothing. No baptisms, no confirmations, no burials. The thread is cut each time a union involving the reline is recorded. It is as if the family absorbed its own offspring, swallowing them back into itself. And yet, one detail refuses to stay buried. In the 1836 register, a marginal note appears beside a marriage of Nathaniel Rhea to Ruth Rhea. The priest's hand is steady, meticulous, but in the margin, another hand, sharper, darker, has written 3 words: "No infants emerge." That phrase is crossed out in lighter ink, almost apologetic, with the annotation, "Not our concern." But the silence in the baptisms could not hide everything, because outside the parish, one midwife kept her own private logs. Her name was Martha Keene, a quiet woman who delivered nearly 100 children across the North End. In her notebooks, now water-stained but legible, 6 births are listed under variations of the Rhea family. Each child survived the first breath, each weighed normally, but in every case she notes the same disturbing observation: eyes too, O-aligned. Hands clenched, refused to open. By 1850, her tone has shifted. She stops writing names. Instead, she describes silence. One entry reads, "Born at dawn. They did not cry. Parents nodded, but spoke no word." And then, in her final entry in 1868, she abandons words altogether. A charcoal smear pressed into the page, as though language itself had failed. The parish pretended it was an omission. The state ignored it as clerical error. But when every page shows absence where there should be life, you are no longer looking at mistakes. You are looking at suppression. By 1873, whispers had leaked beyond the parish walls. Physicians who dared to cross into the North End carried back accounts not fit for polite company. One doctor, anonymous in the Massachusetts general logbooks but recognizable by his handwriting, recorded a peculiar request: to examine a child who has not grown in 4 years, though her mind has advanced like clockwork. The examination never appears in official medical journals, but his notes survive in fragments, tucked in the back of an anatomy text. The lines are cold, clinical, until they falter at the margins. The girl resembles her brother in feature to such a degree that distinction is impossible. When asked her age, she first said 8, then corrected herself to 12. Her eyes would not blink in sequence, but alternated, one closing, the other watching. It was around this time that the word inbred began to circulate, not in the streets but in the private correspondences of ministers and physicians who feared scandal. They spoke not only of cousins marrying cousins, but of something more radical: the deliberate recycling of blood, the refusal to let any outside line enter. Generation upon generation, the tree folded in on itself until it became less a tree than a closed loop. But here is where the accounts diverge. Some insisted this was a grotesque experiment in purity, a family obsessed with keeping their names uncontaminated by immigrants who flooded Boston's wharves. Others swore it was not purity but preservation, that they believed themselves keepers of a flame that would die if mingled with common blood. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same: children born with eyes too large for their skulls, voices echoing one another as if they shared the same breath. One priest, in a letter sealed but later opened by the diocese, wrote, "I cannot baptize what is already returned. They do not multiply, tehikit." The neighbors, of course, had always whispered. They noticed the shutters never opened, even in summer when Boston's air turned thick as broth. They noticed the children. if they could be called that, who emerged only at dusk, walking 2 by 2 as if rehearsed, their steps perfectly synchronized, their gazes fixed ahead. But in 1874, something happened that forced silence into sound. A fire broke out in a bakery on Prince Street. The whole block rushed into the street, buckets in hand, frantic shouts echoing through the narrow alleys. And it was then, under the flickering blaze, that the family appeared in the open. Witnesses swore the sight was unforgettable. 4 children stood together at the edge of the firelight. Their faces were pale, waxen, and so identical that neighbors argued afterward whether they were siblings, cousins, or copies of the same child. Their mouths moved in unison, whispering something no one else could hear. One old woman said it sounded like a prayer, but inverted, words tumbling backward as though rewound. The fire was contained. The bakery was saved. Yet by dawn the gossip was no longer about smoke or charred wood, but about the children whose faces no one could forget. The Boston Evening Transcript, careful to avoid slander, published a single cryptic line in its community notices. A family of singular resemblance was observed in the North End during last night's calamity. That sentence alone was enough to stir curiosity among the city's elite. Doctors and clergymen who had tried to contain their knowledge now faced questions. Why had no burials been recorded for this family? Why did the census list the same names, repeated across decades, with only slight variations in age? Behind closed doors, the family tightened their rituals. Outsiders called it superstition. Insiders called it preservation. But the city, once content to look away, had caught its first glimpse of the truth. And when Boston looks, it does not easily forget. By the summer of 1875, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Boston's newspapers, ever hungry for oddities, began to circle. The Transcript's cryptic line had been enough to plant a seed, and rival editors, smelling blood and circulation, demanded more. Reporters lingered in the North End, pretending to sketch street scenes but really watching the narrow house with shuttered windows. At first, the family held fast. The shutters stayed locked, and the children were ushered out only after dark, their movements synchronized as always, each step as careful as though rehearsed. But Boston thrives on scandal, and the void of silence was quickly filled with invention. Pamphlets began appearing in taverns and coffee houses. Some claimed the family were not children at all, but wax mannequins animated by secret rites. Others swore they were offspring of a European experiment, brought across the Atlantic to escape scrutiny. A few went further still, suggesting they were harbingers, omens dressed in human skin. The more the family refused to explain themselves, the more the city demanded answers. A minister from Beacon Hill gave a sermon warning against false children who walk among us, bred of science or sin. His words were reprinted the next morning in the Boston Daily Advertiser, beneath a woodcut of faceless silhouettes marching in step. Soon the house was no longer just a curiosity. It was a spectacle. Street urchins dared each other to throw stones at its shutters. Men in stovepipe hats lingered at corners, waiting for a glimpse. And late at night, someone scrawled across the front door in chalk, "Not of God." Inside, the family gathered by lamplight, the identical children lined in perfect rows, their mouths moving in unison, not praying, not speaking, but rehearsing something. Their father, gaunt and trembling, whispered to his wife, "They will not let us remain unsaved, and much longer." The siege had begun, not of fire and gunpowder, but of curiosity sharpened into suspicion. And Boston, once captivated by its tea and trade, now hungered for something darker. It happened on a rain-slicked night in October. The family had grown used to the murmur of crowds outside, the knocks at odd hours, even the stones clattering against the shutters. But this time the intruders did not linger on the street. 2 men, reporters by trade, though closer to scavengers than journalists, forced the back gate and crept through the overgrown garden. They carried lanterns, their light bobbing between the tangled vines. One whispered he had been promised a fortune if he returned with proof, any proof, that the children inside were not what they seemed. The door was locked, but the window latch gave way beneath the press of a knife. Inside, the house smelled of tallow and damp wood, as though air had not been allowed to move freely for years. The men pressed forward, their lanterns painting yellow circles across the wallpaper. Then they froze. At the end of the corridor, 12 figures stood in a line. Children, each with the same narrow face, the same hollow eyes, the same unblinking stillness. They did not scream, nor rush forward, nor scatter as normal children might. They simply stared. The reporters tried to laugh, but the sound broke in their throats. One managed to croak, "Which of you is real?" And then the children opened their mouths, every one of them at once, but no sound came out, just the movement of lips, identical, rehearsed, as though answering a question only they could hear. When the men stumbled backward, crashing through the window they had entered, one swore he felt a dozen hands brush his sleeve, cold, deliberate, and all in perfect unison. The next morning, the story was in print. The House of the 12, a family not of nature. Circulation soared. Boston had its scandal, and the family had lost the one thing they had clung to most desperately: secrecy. From that night on, the children were no longer just whispered about, they were hunted. The morning after the article broke, Boston awoke to a city divided. Some claimed the reporters had staged the entire story, actors, tricks of light, hysteria for profit. Others whispered that what the men had seen was only a fragment of something far darker, a family whose existence itself was an affront to nature. By noon, the courthouse was packed. Clergymen thundered from pulpits demanding investigation. "If Providence has cursed this house," one preacher shouted, "then we must not let the plague spread to our city." His words rang through the streets, drawing both the devout and the curious into a frenzy. The authorities, reluctant but pressured by the uproar, dispatched a delegation, a constable, 2 magistrates, and a minister who had made a name by exorcising unnatural households. They marched to the family's doorstep, trailed by a mob that swelled with every block. Inside, the family prepared. The father stacked furniture against the door, the mother clutched her children as though she could will them into ordinary flesh and blood. Yet when the delegation arrived, the door swung open without resistance. The family had chosen not to hide. What the officials found was not monstrous, at least not in the way the mob had expected. The children sat in neat rows upon wooden chairs, hands folded, faces blank. They breathed in unison, blinked in unison. To the magistrates it was eerie, yes, but not criminal. To the minister it was proof. "These are not children," he declared, voice shaking with triumph. "These are vessels, and vessels must be emptied." The mob roared its approval outside, though none had seen what the minister had seen. In that moment, the family realized the truth. It no longer mattered what they were. The world had already. Night fell heavy on Boston. The mob, restless after the minister's proclamation, lingered in the streets with torches and psalms that sounded more like curses. Windows rattled with every chant, every pounding hymn. The family huddled in silence, but silence had become a death sentence. The father knew they could not endure another day. At midnight he whispered his plan. They would slip through the alleys, avoid the main road, and head toward the river. If they could reach the ferry, perhaps Providence, or at least distance, would grant them mercy. The children did not protest. They rose as one, moving in the same smooth motion that had terrified outsiders. The mother wrapped them in cloaks, hoping to dull the effect of their sameness, but even cloaked, the air seemed to warp around them. They crept into the night. The city was not asleep. From windows, eyes glowed with suspicion. Dogs barked. Church bells rang faintly as though stirred by invisible hands. In every shadow, the family feared discovery. Halfway to the river, a boy on a rooftop spotted them. He screamed, "The vessels are loose!" The cry echoed down the street, igniting the mob like fire on dry hay. Torches flared, boots thundered. 100 voices chased them through twisting alleys. The family ran, not with the chaos of panic, but with the strange, synchronized grace that had damned them from the start. At the edge of the docks, they saw Salvation, the ferry, tethered loosely, rocking with the current. But Salvation was not built for them. The ferryman, pale and trembling, cut the rope before they reached him. The vessel drifted away, leaving only dark water and the mob closing in. The father turned to his family. His face was ash. "Then we go where they cannot follow." He pointed not to the water, but to the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the old wharf, a place even Boston feared. And without hesitation, the family descended into the black. The tunnels breathed. That was the first thing they noticed as they slipped into the black throat beneath the wharf. The air rose and fell like the lungs of something immense, unseen. The family moved single file, torches left behind, their steps guided by instinct. The walls dripped with salt and age. The beams creaked overhead as though groaning at their intrusion. For the first time that night, there was no mob, no torches, no cries of damnation. Only silence. Yet the silence did not soothe. It pressed in, thick and watchful. Every droplet that fell echoed like a warning bell. The children walked without hesitation, their bodies aligned as if pulled by the same thread. The mother whispered a prayer, though her lips shook. But prayers faltered here. The words refused to rise. Deeper they went. The father carried only a lantern, and its flame trembled like prey in a predator's gaze. In the shadows between the flickers, shapes seemed to twitch, arches bending wrong, stones swelling like muscle. At a bend in the tunnel, the youngest child stopped. She placed her hand against the wall. The stone was not cold. It was warm, pulsing faintly, as though blood flowed beneath it. The father pulled her away, but the wall seemed to sigh in protest. Then they heard it, not the mob above, but something older, moving below. A groan, low and cavernous, vibrating through the ground. The children tilted their heads in unison, listening with eerie calm. The mother could no longer restrain her voice. "We should have taken the water," she whispered. But it was too late. Behind them, the tunnel sealed with a crash of stone and earth. Ahead, the passage sloped downward, deeper into the marrow of the city, and the family, bound in sameness, walked into it without turning back. The downward slope grew slick, the walls narrowing until the family had to stoop, their shoulders brushing damp stone. Yet what they touched did not feel like stone. It yielded slightly, spongy, as if the passage itself were a throat. The lantern flame sputtered, gasping for air, and in its failing glow the walls seemed to twitch. Veins of moisture pulsed faintly along the surface, glowing with a sickly sheen, like veins illuminated beneath thin skin. The children did not flinch. They pressed onward, eyes wide, pupils dilated, as if attuned to a different kind of light. Their movements were no longer hesitant. They were synchronized, as though following instructions whispered just beyond hearing. The father staggered, his breath ragged. "It's not a tunnel," he croaked. But the words were useless. His wife already knew. She clutched his arm with trembling fingers, nails digging into his flesh, not out of anger, but terror of what she dared not name. And then the sound returned. A low vibration, deep within the walls, like a heart the size of the harbor itself. With each beat, dust rained from the beams above. With each beat, the lantern shivered. The youngest child laughed, a high, thin laugh that did not belong to her. She pointed forward to where the tunnel widened into a cavern. There, shapes waited. Not human, not stone. Hulking forms fused into the walls, half born from the rock, their faces stretched in silent screams. The father raised the lantern higher, but the flame recoiled as though refusing to shine upon them. The mother whispered, "God help us," though even she felt the prayer had been smothered by the earth itself. Still, the children stepped forward, fearless, their small hands brushing the frozen faces in the walls as if greeting old friends. And as they did, the cavern exhaled. A gust of heat and rot, as though something vast and hidden had finally noticed their arrival. The cavern stretched wide, swallowing the lantern's weak light. Its roof disappeared into blackness, and the walls seemed alive with movement, not shifting rock, but something that glistened, quivering, like flesh breathing just beyond sight. The parents froze. Their instincts screamed to turn back, but the children pressed on, their little feet steady on the damp floor. They did not hesitate, they did not tremble. It was as though they had been here before. The eldest boy lifted his hand. The air itself seemed to stir around him, dust curling into patterns like smoke. The younger girl whispered words her parents could not understand, syllables that rang against the bones more than the ears. The father tried to call out to them. His voice cracked, thin, useless. The sound dissolved into the cavern's breathing, swallowed whole. And then it came again, the rhythm. Not a sound, not a voice, but a presence. A heartbeat, vast and subterranean, beating beneath Boston's soil, older than the cobblestones, older than the Puritan dead, older even than the first tribes who feared this ground. The children tilted their heads, listening, smiling. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, catching a light that wasn't the lantern's. The mother clutched her husband's arm, nails drawing blood. Her whisper was more desperate than prayer now. "They're not ours anymore." Something shifted in the dark. The cavern exhaled again, carrying with it the scent of iron and decay. Not words, but recognition, as if the earth itself had reached out and touched the children, claiming them. The father's lantern guttered, its flame shrinking low, as though refusing to witness what was to come. The children stepped deeper into the cavern, unafraid. They no longer seemed lost. They seemed home. The lantern sputtered once, then steadied, but its glow was feeble against the vastness. The parents stood rooted, as though the stone beneath their boots had fused to their flesh. Their children had gone ahead, two small silhouettes swallowed by a cavern older than memory. The father's throat tightened with the urge to shout, to command, to beg, but no words came. He realized with sick clarity, his voice no longer belonged here. This place did not recognize him. The children, though, this place welcomed them. The boy's hand traced the air as though drawing symbols unseen. Each motion was answered by a shudder in the stone, a pulse of warmth that rose through the ground. The girl's whispers grew louder, rippling the cavern's silence. Her words were not childish babble anymore. They carried the cadence of liturgy, something recited, something remembered. And then something answered. Not in words, not in sound, but in a tremor that rattled the marrow in their bones. The cavern's walls swelled, contracting, as though this hollow space itself were a lung taking in air for the first time in centuries. Veins of mineral glowed faintly, golden at first, then deepening into the color of old blood. The mother's knees buckled. She clawed at her husband's sleeve, whispering in frantic gasps, "It knows them. It knows their names." The father wanted to deny it, but he felt it too. Their children's names pulsed in his skull, unspoken, vibrating, echoing through the rock. Not as words he heard, but as truths he remembered being told. The ground beneath them split hairline cracks, exhaling warm breath that stank of rot and iron. In the flicker of failing light, the father thought he saw something move beneath the stone, like a body straining under thin fabric, desperate to rise. The boy and girl turned back just once to look at their parents, but their eyes no longer belonged to them. They burned faintly, like lanterns lit from within by a fire not meant for human flesh. The cavern's heartbeat grew louder, closer. The parents, trembling and powerless, understood. Something vast had chosen their children, and nothing they did now could unmake that claim. The cavern's silence cracked. At first it was a low groan, like timbers of an ancient ship straining in a storm. Then came the rending, stone splitting open, as though something vast pressed upward from beneath. The parents staggered back, shielding their faces from shards of falling rock. Dust rolled in choking clouds, but through it they saw their children stand unflinching. The boy's arms were raised, not in defense but in welcome. The girl's lips still moved, but now the cavern itself seemed to echo her chant, repeating her words in tones deeper than any human throat. Then the floor bulged. The stone flexed, impossibly like skin. Beneath its surface, shapes stirred, ridges like ribs, veins that glowed red gold, and something like an eye, too large, too wrong, pressing upward against the rock as though testing its shell. The mother screamed. The sound was swallowed instantly, as if the cavern drank it down. The father stumbled forward, instincts tearing through terror. He seized his son's arm, only to recoil. The boy's skin burned against his hand, pulsing with a heat that was not his own. For one horrifying instant, the father thought he felt a second heartbeat inside his son, louder than his own chest. The girl turned to him then. Her voice was not her voice. It carried layers, harmonics that vibrated the stone. "Father," she said. But it was not a plea. It was an accusation, a sentence, a farewell. The bulging stone cracked open with a sound like thunder. Through the fissure surged a light, not radiant, not holy, but the sickly glow of something buried too long. It painted the children's faces in hues that erased their humanity. Something beneath Boston was rising, and their children were no longer merely children. The cavern floor did not simply crack. It gave way. Stone slabs toppled inward, vanishing into a pit that had not been there moments before. From that abyss rose a draught of air so foul, so old, it carried with it the stench of oceans that had never known the sun. And then it touched them. Not air, but a presence. A weight that pressed against their chests, squeezing breath from lungs. The parents collapsed to their knees, clutching their ribs as if their very bones were bending inward. From the fissure, something moved. First, a limb. Vast and glistening, its surface neither flesh nor stone, but something in between. Its texture writhed, as though countless smaller shapes crawled just beneath its skin. It slid upward, dragging itself through the gap, and where it touched the cavern floor, the rock blackened and cracked like scorched earth. The children did not recoil. They leaned closer. The boy's eyes burned like coals now, his irises gone, his gaze fixed not on his parents but on the emerging limb. The girl spread her arms wide as though she had awaited this moment for centuries. Her chant grew louder, echoing until the cavern itself shook, stalactites trembling above like teeth ready to fall. The mother clutched her husband's hand, tears streaking through the dust on her face. She tried to scream for her children, but no sound came. Her voice was crushed beneath the pressure of the thing's rising breath. And then, from the abyss, something more appeared. Not a face, not a claw. Something far worse. A maw without symmetry, lined with teeth that seemed to grow as they watched, each one twisting into shapes that mocked the idea of life. It opened wide, not to devour, but to breathe. The cavern inhaled with it, and in that breath, the parents knew. Boston was not a city built upon the earth. Boston was a city built above a prison, and the prison had just been breached. The cavern no longer felt like stone and earth. It pulsed, alive, as though the walls themselves were veins. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending toward the pit, drawn to the limb that had risen from it. The father forced himself upright, dragging his wife with him. His voice came in ragged gasps. "Children, come back, please." But the children did not turn. The boy's head tilted just slightly, enough to show that he had heard, but his smile was one of recognition, not of a parent, but of a man who had served his purpose. The girl did not even look at them. She was transfixed by the shifting maw that gaped wider with every breath, her voice rising into a shriek that sounded less like words and more like 1,000 whispers layered together. And then the mother saw it. She blinked once, twice, disbelieving, but the truth could not be denied. Her daughter's shadow no longer matched her body. Where the little girl stood, her shadow stretched impossibly tall, arms elongated, fingers branching into shapes that looked like talons. The boy's shadow was worse. It had no body at all. It was a hollow, gaping hole where a child should be, its edges rippling as if straining to widen. The parents staggered back, horror dawning not from the creature rising, but from the realization before them. Their children were not being taken. They had always belonged to this thing. The cavern rumbled again, a guttural vibration from beneath the pit. Dust rained down in clouds, and the mother clutched her husband's chest, whispering in a voice that cracked under despair, "They were never ours." Her words echoed louder than the chant, louder even than the trembling of the earth. For the first time, the children turned their heads together, their gaze locking onto their parents, not with recognition, but with judgment. It was the look of wardens, not prisoners. The silence after the mother's words was unbearable. The chanting stopped. The pit itself seemed to hold its breath, and then it was the children who moved. The boy stepped forward, but his feet never touched the ground. His body hovered inches above the stone, as though the hollow of his shadow below pulled him upward. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, glowing faintly in the cavern's darkness. The girl turned her head slowly, her eyes fixing on her parents with a pity that did not belong to any child. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to speak, but when she opened her mouth, it was not her voice that came. It was older. It was colder. It was a voice that had been buried for centuries. "You carried them," it said through her, "but they were never yours." The father shook his head violently, stumbling backward. No, you're wrong. His voice broke, the words collapsing into a sob. The girl raised her hand and her shadow's talons stretched out across the stone, brushing against her mother's feet. The mother screamed and jerked back, but no claw had touched her. Only the shadow had, and yet her skin burned where the darkness lingered. The boy's mouth opened wide, unnaturally wide, wider than his skull should have allowed. A low hum vibrated out of him, matching the cavern's pulse. The walls shook in rhythm, dust and bone falling from above. The parents' horror deepened with the realization their children were not becoming part of the cavern, they were its mouthpieces. The girl's hand trembled, and her gaze softened for just an instant, the briefest flicker of the daughter she had once been. She whispered, this time in her own voice, "Run." The cavern roared to life, shadows writhing like living serpents across the stone, and the parents finally understood. Escape was no longer about saving their children. It was about surviving what their children had become. The father grabbed his wife's hand, yanking her toward the tunnel's mouth. Stones bit into their palms as they scrambled up the slope, the echo of their children's voices twisting in the air behind them. But they didn't get far. At the halfway point, the girl was suddenly there, not walking, not running, simply there. Her body was impossibly still, her feet just brushing the ground, her hair floating as though under water. Her eyes, once full of light, now shone with a void so deep it seemed to drink the lantern's glow. The mother froze, every instinct in her screaming to hold her daughter, to pull her close, to deny what she saw. But the girl's shadow stretched across the walls in the shape of something vast. Wings, teeth, eyes, things that had no name. "Move," the father hissed, pulling at her arm, but she couldn't. And then the boy appeared. He climbed the stone slope with jerks and spasms, his limbs bending in ways that tore at the mind to witness. His mouth was still open in that awful, unending hum, vibrating so violently the cavern shook around them. The tunnel behind him crumbled, as if the earth itself bent to his song. The parents were trapped. Their son stood below, their daughter above, both watching, both waiting. The mother fell to her knees, sobbing, "Please, let us go. We'll do anything. Just let us go." The girl tilted her head as if weighing her mother's plea. For a moment mercy seemed possible, but then her lips curled into a faint, unnatural smile, a smile that belonged to something older than time. "You don't understand," she whispered. "This place isn't keeping you here." The shadows writhed, sliding across the walls, the ceiling, the floor, closing in from every direction. "It's keeping us." The parents' screams were swallowed by the dark. The cave shifted. It wasn't rock anymore. It was breathing. The walls pulsed like flesh, veins of black ichor running across the stone as if the earth had grown sick. The lantern light flickered, and with each flicker, the truth showed itself. The children weren't just standing there. They were anchored. The boy's arms hung loose at his sides, but from his shadow rose the jagged outline of spines and horns, arching taller with every breath of his hum. His song had deepened now, no longer a vibration. It was the sound of roots tearing through bone, the sound of the world remembering a language it had buried. The girl, still and watchful, spread her arms. The cavern obeyed. Shadows spilled out from her fingertips like liquid, crawling across the walls until they touched her brother's hum. Where sound met shadow, something else began to form, something vast, skeletal, and crawling out of the stone. The father staggered backward, dragging his wife with him. But no matter where he looked, the thing's shape grew larger. A head brushing the ceiling, claws unfurling from the dripping walls, dozens of eyes, not human, not animal, opening at once and staring with bottomless hunger. The girl's voice broke the air, calm and matter-of-fact, as if explaining a truth they should have always known. "He was never asleep," she said. The mother clutched her chest, choking on air. "What are you talking about? Who?" Her daughter's eyes glowed with a terrible reverence. "The one buried beneath the roots, the one who whispers through the cracks, the one you woke when you dug too deep." The cavern trembled violently, rocks split apart. A foul, ancient breath rose up from the depths, filling their lungs, making them gag. The boy's hum grew unbearable, rattling teeth, snapping lantern glass. The shadows merged with it, swirling upward, until the very outline of the thing becomes clear. A towering skeletal titan bound in stone, its ribs stretched like the cage of a forgotten god. The parents saw it then. Not a hallucination, not madness. The earth itself was giving birth, and their children were its midwives. The father lunged first. He had no weapon, only his hands, calloused from years of soil and stone. He grabbed his son's shoulders, shaking him, shouting through the thunder of the hum, "Stop! You're killing us! You're killing everything!" But the boy didn't even blink. His body was limp, almost puppet-like, while the sound pouring out of him grew deeper, wider, like an organ made of earth itself. His shadow spines arched higher, piercing the ceiling. Shards of rock rained down, slicing the father's skin, but he held on, refusing to let go. The mother rushed to the girl. She fell to her knees, clutching her daughter's arms, pleading with a desperation only a mother could summon. "Please, baby. You're not this. You're mine. Come back to me." The girl turned her head slowly, eyes shining like polished obsidian. She smiled faintly, as if pitying her mother. "You never raised us. You only sheltered us until the roots were ready to bloom." Then her shadow writhed, wrapping around her mother's wrists, squeezing until her bones creaked. The mother screamed, trying to pull free, but the shadow held fast. The father, bleeding and trembling, roared and slammed his son against the cavern wall. For the first time, the boy's hum cracked, a jarring note that made the entire cave stutter. The massive skeletal shape above them flickered, like smoke about to be blown away. The girl shrieked, the sound sharper than glass. Her shadow whipped out violently, striking her father across the chest. He collapsed against the stone, choking on blood. The mother broke free just long enough to crawl to him. She cradled his head, sobbing. Above them, the creature pressed harder against its stone womb. A rib the size of a tree splintered through the ceiling. Dust rained like ash. The cave shook so violently that it felt as if the world itself were tearing apart. The boy's hum steadied. Again. The girl's shadows returned to their rhythm. The skeletal titan's outline solidified, its skull lowering, its empty sockets staring directly at the broken parents. And then, as if offering a cruel mercy, the children spoke in unison. "You should not have dug here." The cave could no longer contain it. With a sound like mountains splitting, the ceiling tore open. The ribs of the skeletal colossus pushed through stone as if it were paper. Rock and soil tumbled downward in thunderous cascades, burying lanterns, smashing timbers. The parents clung to each other beneath the collapsing world, their children standing untouched in the storm of ruin. The boy's hum deepened until the ground itself cracked in spirals, glowing veins of molten light opening beneath his feet. The girl's shadows swarmed like a black tide, wrapping around the falling boulders, holding them in place long enough for the creature above to push further into the world. The titan's skull forced itself through, its teeth grating against the cavern walls, sparks of stone fire raining as it moved. Empty sockets glowed faintly, like stars buried deep underground. The mother screamed over the chaos. "If it rises, everything dies." The father staggered forward, blood soaking his shirt. He held a jagged piece of timber, the only weapon left in his trembling hands. He raised it high, eyes fixed on his son. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Forgive me." But before he could strike, the boy's eyes snapped open. For the first time he looked at his father, not blank, not distant, but with a knowing gaze. a terrible recognition. "You can't kill us," the boy said calmly, his voice layered with the rumble of the earth. "We are not yours anymore." The girl laughed softly, and her shadows reached out, coiling like serpents around her father's throat. The timber fell from his grip as he clawed for breath. The mother leapt forward, tearing at the shadows, screaming her children's names until her voice broke. Her cries were swallowed by the roar of the creature pushing through the cavern roof. A final tremor shook the chamber as the Titan's jaw cracked open, revealing an abyss lined with teeth older than stone. The world above had begun to notice. The cave was no longer a cave. It had become a throat, narrowing, trembling, swallowing itself in fits of stone and dust. The air reeked of burning metal and old blood, as if the earth's lungs had been punctured. The parents fought to stay upright, but the ground pitched like the deck of a sinking ship. Each tremor sent cracks racing through the floor, glowing red as if fire waited just below the skin of the world. The boy stood calm amid the collapse, his tiny chest rising and falling with impossible steadiness. The hum pouring from him had changed again, not one note but many, a choir of voices echoing through the cavern, some high and shrill, others impossibly deep. The sound threaded itself into the bones of his parents, making their teeth ache, their spines vibrate like tuning forks. The girl had become something else entirely. Her shadows had lengthened until they no longer resembled anything human. They slithered and snapped, wrapping the cavern's walls like ribs of black fire. She drifted just above the ground, hair fanning out around her face as though caught in a constant wind. "Do you see it, Mother?" she whispered, her voice like silk drawn over broken glass. "Do you finally see why we were given to you?" The mother shook her head violently, tears blinding her eyes. "No, no, you're still my children. You're mine." The girl's smile curved cruelly. "We were never yours. We were only waiting inside you." The father collapsed to his knees, coughing blood, eyes wide with despair. Behind him, the creature above gave one last convulsion. Its jaw scraped against the cavern roof, snapping stone into powder as its body surged upward into the unseen night. The sound that followed was not of stone or earth. It was a breath. The Titan had inhaled, and the world had begun to exhale. Far above the collapsing cavern, the village shuddered awake. Animals screamed first. Horses tore free of their tethers, eyes rolling white, stamping the ground as though it were fire. Dogs howled in unison, tails stiff, bodies pressed flat to the dirt. Even the chickens, locked in their pens, beat their wings until feathers filled the night air like falling snow. Then the ground itself betrayed them. Windows rattled, roofs sagged, and wells split down the middle with sharp, cracking reports. The moon, hanging low and swollen, seemed to pulse with each tremor, as though answering something far older and deeper than the villagers' prayers. People poured into the streets, half-dressed, clutching candles that sputtered uselessly in the trembling air. Mothers clutched infants, fathers dragged children by the arms, yet all of them froze the same moment the sound reached them. It was not thunder, it was not wind. It was the groan of something impossibly vast, dragging itself from the marrow of the earth. The fields beyond the village swelled like breathing flesh, rows of corn snapping under the heave. Barns tipped sideways, wagons collapsed as if pressed by invisible hands. Then, with a deafening rip, the soil tore open. What rose was not a head, not even a face. It was an eye, a lidless, burning eye the size of the mill pond, staring up at the night sky. Its iris shimmered like molten gold, its pupil a tunnel into darkness deeper than the caves below, and as it opened fully, the villagers fell silent. They had not been cursed. They had not been punished. They had been seen. The cavern shook like a living lung about to burst. Stones fell in violent bursts from the ceiling, striking sparks against the farmers' rusted tools. The tunnels that had once whispered now screamed, every crack in the stone echoing with the sound of a world unraveling. The farmer clutched his son, holding him so tightly the boy could barely breathe. His wife pressed against them both, shielding her face with trembling arms as dust rained down in choking clouds. The smell of the earth was no longer soil, but ash, dry, bitter, suffocating. But the boy was smiling. His small hands reached upward, fingers twitching as though answering a silent command. His eyes had gone entirely white, as if reflecting the terrible blaze above. He whispered words his parents could not understand, syllables that grated against the bones, the same guttural notes the voices in the cave had once sung. The farmer shook him hard, desperate. "Stop it! Stop it, my son! Stop!" But the boy's voice only grew louder, his frail body trembling with each utterance. Then the floor beneath them lurched. The fissure split wide open, glowing faintly from some unseen light below. A wind howled up through it, carrying with it the stench of iron and rot, as though the cavern had torn straight into a wound. The farmer tried to drag his family back, but the earth betrayed him. The fissure yawned wider, swallowing their lantern, their cart, their tools. And from the depths below, the same golden glow that now illuminated the village above began to pour upward, flooding the cavern in a light that burned yet offered no warmth. The boy turned toward his father, lips curling into something between a grin and a grimace. "It's awake," he said, and the ground collapsed beneath their feet. There was no scream loud enough to match the fall. The farmer clutched his wife and son as the floor gave way beneath them. The darkness swallowed them whole, yet it was no true dark. Threads of golden veins raced down the cavern walls, chasing them as they plummeted. It was as though the very earth itself had grown eyes, watching, tracking, waiting. The air tore past them in violent gusts, thick with dust and the reek of burning stone. His wife's cry fractured into silence as her voice was drowned in the roar of collapsing rock. The farmer's grip burned into his son's arm, but the boy did not struggle. No. The boy spread his arms wide as though embracing the fall, his face serene against the terror around him. The farmer's stomach churned with the sickening realization. His son wanted this. Below, a light grew. Not fire, not lantern, not anything mortal. It pulsed, steady and immense, like the heartbeat of something too vast to fit inside the earth. The closer they drew, the stronger the pull became, not gravity, but something stranger, heavier, a drag upon the very marrow of his bones. They slammed against an outcropping, stones shattering around them. Pain erupted through the farmer's chest, but he refused to let go. His wife clung weakly to his shoulder, blood trickling from her brow, and still the boy smiled, staring down at the impossible glow beneath them. The farmer forced himself upright on the ledge, lungs burning. He dared one glance into the abyss, and wished he hadn't. For down there, coiled and infinite, was no cavern floor. It was an opening, a maw, and deep within its depths, the golden light was not shining but breathing. The boy leaned forward, whispering into the abyss, "It hears me," and the abyss whispered back. The abyss did not echo like a cavern should. It spoke. The farmer staggered to his feet, clutching his wife as she gasped for breath. The golden veins throbbed across the rock, pulsing in rhythm with the vast glow below. It was no reflection, no natural fire. It was a living heartbeat. The ledge beneath their feet trembled, dust sifting down into the endless pit. His eyes strained to make sense of the impossible. A landscape that seemed to move even as it remained still. There was no bottom, only folds upon folds of something that writhed, breathing like lungs the size of cities. And within the glow, a pattern emerged. At first he thought it was stone, or the way light played tricks, but then it shifted. Lines bent into shapes, shapes into faces. Not one face, but hundreds stacked upon each other, layered in molten contours of gold. Men, women, children, their mouths open in silent cries, their eyes shimmering like fireflies trapped in amber. His wife turned her head away with a strangled sob. "Dear God, it's made of them." The boy did not recoil. Instead, he stepped closer to the ledge, arms outstretched toward the faces that blinked and merged, each one melting seamlessly into the next. "They are not gone," he whispered. "They are inside it, waiting." The farmer pulled him back with trembling hands. "Waiting for what?" he demanded, though he already knew. The abyss answered. From the depths came a sound like a choir of 1,000 voices, rising and falling, dissonant, yet in perfect unity. Words formed in their marrow, not in their ears. We are the roots. We drink the blood. We remember the first man. We will rise through you. The boy's smile widened, and for the first time the farmer saw. His son's veins were glowing, faint threads of gold racing under his skin, as though the abyss had already claimed him. The stone beneath their feet buckled as if breathing with the abyss. The ledge cracked in long, jagged lines, threatening to give way at any moment. Dust cascaded down into the golden void, vanishing into its impossible depth. The boy's body jerked forward. At first it looked like a stumble. Then the farmer saw the truth. The veins of light under his son's skin pulsed in unison with the abyss, each glow a tether. The faces below leaned upward, mouths opening wider, drawing him in with a hunger older than language. The farmer lunged, wrapping his arms around the boy's chest. His wife clung to his sleeve, terror-stricken, her breath ragged. The child did not struggle. His face was serene, almost joyful, as though he had found a home he had been seeking all along. "Let me go, father," the boy whispered. His voice was not his own, it was layered, a chorus of many speaking as one. "I belong to them. I always did." "No!" the farmer roared, dragging him back, his muscles straining against an invisible pull. He could feel it, like a tide, drawing his son toward the abyss with a force that did not come from the world of men. The abyss pulsed harder. Golden arcs flared like lightning, striking upward, searing the walls of the cavern. Each arc carried the silhouettes of grasping hands, spectral fingers stretching for the boy. The faces below screamed without sound, their mouths yawning wider, 1,000 throats gasping to swallow him whole. The farmer's grip slipped. His wife screamed his name. For one dreadful instant the boy's hand reached out, fingertips brushing the glow, and the abyss answered. The golden veins surged brighter across his skin, racing up his throat toward his eyes. The farmer knew, if his son touched it fully, he would not be his son anymore. He had one choice: let go, or tear him free by force, even if it broke him. The boy's fingers grazed the shimmering light, and in that instant, the farmer acted. With a guttural roar, he wrenched his son backward, every tendon in his arms straining until they felt as though they might rip apart. The boy screamed, not from pain, but from a grief so unnatural it shook the cavern. The sound was not his alone. It was joined by 100 other voices, all shrieking through his small frame. The abyss reacted violently. The golden arcs snapped upward like whips, striking the walls, carving glowing scars into the stone. A gust of hot wind burst from below, carrying with it the stench of burning earth, and something worse, the iron tang of blood. The boy convulsed, his body twisting in ways no child's body should. His veins bulged with light, writhing under his skin like serpents. His eyes rolled white, and when they opened again, they glowed with the abyss itself, radiant, endless, merciless. The farmer pinned him to the ground, sobbing, his calloused hands pressing into his son's small shoulders. "You are mine," he growled through tears, "not theirs, not ever." But the abyss would not yield so easily. The ledge cracked again, whole slabs tumbling into the void. The child's chest heaved, rising and falling with unnatural rhythm. Each breath he took seemed to deepen the pull of the abyss, as though he were the bridge, the living doorway it needed. Then came the words, spilling from his lips in a voice layered and inhuman. "If you keep me, Father, the earth above will drown in what sleeps below." The farmer froze, his face inches from his son's glowing eyes. Behind him, his wife wept, clutching her hands to her mouth, unable to speak, unable to choose. The choice lay with him alone: save his boy and risk unleashing the abyss upon the world, or let him go and lose the only thing that tethered him to hope. Above ground, the village was stirring. The well at the center of town, the same one the farmer had dug, rattled as though something immense were climbing its walls, Buckets and ropes shook violently, clattering against stone. Horses in their stables screamed, kicking through wooden doors until their hooves were raw. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, pointing to the sky. The air itself seemed wrong, heavy, swollen with pressure, as if a storm were gathering not in the clouds, but under their feet. Then came the sound. A low, droning hum, deep enough to rattle bones, rolled beneath the earth. It spread outward in all directions, echoing through roots, stone, and foundations. Villagers pressed their hands to the ground, feeling the vibration crawl into their flesh. One man shouted, "It's coming from Hale's land." The people surged toward the farmhouse, carrying lanterns that flickered as though threatened by unseen hands. By the time they reached the edge of his property, they saw it. A thin line of golden light cutting through the soil, tracing outward from the well like veins across the earth. The ground pulsed, alive. An old woman dropped to her knees, whispering prayers that cracked and faltered. "It's awake," she gasped. "God help us. It's awake." And beneath their terror, the abyss waited. Its opening act not yet complete. Its true release depending on the single choice being made below. The farmer stood at the edge of the chasm, his son's tiny chest rising and falling in fragile breaths. The voice, no longer a whisper but a chorus, coiled around him, pressing into his skull like 1,000 hands. "Decide." The command throbbed through his bones, louder than the screams he thought he heard from far above. Villagers, animals, the very earth groaning. Somehow the abyss was letting him hear both worlds at once. Sweat poured down his face, his knees buckled. He looked at his son, pale and unmoving, his lips trembling as though trying to form words. For an instant the farmer swore he heard his boy's faint whisper, "Papa." The abyss laughed. Not a sound, but a vibration so deep it bent his spine. 1 life for 1,000, 1,000 for the boy. Behind him, the golden veins crawled closer, the humming cage tightening. His body burned, his thoughts blurred. He pressed the child to his chest, eyes wild, torn between love and terror. If he chose wrong, both would be lost. If he chose nothing, the abyss would choose for him. And then, his son's eyes flickered open, for just a second, but it was enough. The farmer's mouth opened, his decision ready to tear the world apart. The farmer's lips trembled, words hovering but refusing to form. The abyss pulsed, a living thing, feeding on his hesitation. The golden veins pressed tighter around him, their hum rising like a swarm of hornets in his skull. The boy's half-lidded eyes caught his father's. They weren't filled with fear. They were heavy, ancient, as though something far older peered through them. For a heartbeat, the farmer wasn't looking at his son at all. "Do not choose me." The voice didn't come from the abyss. It came from the child, faint, fragile, but clear. His lips hadn't moved. The words had slipped straight into his father's mind. The farmer shook violently, clutching the boy closer. "No, no, don't ask me that." The abyss laughed again, the vibration rolling through the cavern walls. Stones rained down around them. The farmer dropped to his knees, torn between two hungers. The unnatural force demanding sacrifice, and the sacred bond of blood that told him to defy it. His hands shook, his jaw locked, the decision pushed against his teeth like a blade. And then, silence. The abyss stopped speaking. The veins froze mid-hum. Even the child's shallow breath seemed suspended. The whole world was waiting for him. The farmer took one ragged inhale, raised his head, and finally spoke. The cavern answered before his words even finished. The abyss exhaled, a wind colder than winter sweeping through the hollow earth, carrying with it the scent of iron and rot. The golden veins shuddered, their glow dimming, shrinking back into the stone like roots torn from soil. The boy screamed, not in pain, but in something deeper, something the human throat was never built to release. His cry echoed with centuries, filled with voices, not his own. The sound shook the farmer's bones until he thought they would splinter. The ground convulsed, the abyss widened, swallowing whole slabs of rock. The farmer clutched his son tighter, stumbling backward as the floor cracked beneath his feet. He thought for an instant they would both be pulled under, swallowed into that endless dark. But then, silence. The rumbling ceased. The abyss sealed itself like a mouth closing, the black edges knitting shut until nothing remained but bare stone. The boy went limp in his arms. The farmer pressed his ear to his son's chest, searching desperately for a heartbeat. For a moment, there was nothing, and then, faint, irregular, but there. His son had survived. But the eyes that opened again were not the eyes of his child. The boy stirred in his father's arms, his small hands, once warm and clumsy with youth, now gripped with unnatural strength, fingers digging into the farmer's coat. His breathing was steady, almost too steady. Each inhale precise, mechanical, as though taught by something that had never known lungs. The farmer looked into his son's eyes, praying to see the innocent light he had raised, the spark of a child who once laughed at rain. But what stared back was cold, not hateful, not empty. Something worse, a knowing. It was the gaze of an old intelligence trapped inside a young body. The boy smiled, but it was wrong. A fraction too slow, the curve of the lips rehearsed rather than felt. And when he spoke, his voice was his, yet layered. As if a second mouth, one deeper and ancient, spoke in perfect unison. "Father, we are still here." The farmer froze, his heart hammered in his chest. But he could not let go, could not even breathe. For in that moment he realized, the abyss had not swallowed his son, it had climbed into him, and it was patient. Because whatever had awakened beneath the soil of Ohio in 1856 had no reason to rush. It now had a vessel, a future, a way out. And one day, the world would hear it speak again. The story ends, but the silence that follows carries its own threat, as if the echo of that cavern still waits beneath your feet.